The morning sun filtered weakly through the tall, dusty windows of the county courthouse, casting long golden lines across the polished wood floor. Outside, the September air was brisk, carrying with it the scent of damp leaves and distant traffic. Inside, however, the air was heavy with tension. Every creak of the benches, every cough or shuffle of shoes seemed amplified, echoing in the cavernous room. People had gathered not only for justice but for spectacle. Small-town trials rarely attracted so much attention, but this one had become the center of heated debate, whispered conversations, and newspaper headlines. At the heart of it all sat a young mother, her dark hair tied back in a simple knot, her hands trembling despite her attempts to clasp them tightly in her lap. Her name was Johnson, though most in the room only knew her as the woman from the park. She wore a plain blue dress, one she had ironed carefully that morning, hoping it would make her look composed, though nothing could hide the exhaustion lining her face. Beside her, sitting far too calmly for what was expected, was her daughter, 3 years old, clutching a faded stuffed bunny to her chest. His eyes darted nervously toward the front of the courtroom where the man on trial sat. Officer Daniel Brooks, tall and broad-shouldered, wore his uniform with the kind of stiffness that made it seem more like armor than fabric. His jaw was set, his gaze fixed forward, though occasionally his eyes flicked to the child with something unreadable in their depths. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering something meant to reassure, but Brooks barely moved. The gallery was full of locals, some leaning in to catch every word, others sitting with arms folded, already having made up their minds. Some saw Brooks as a decorated officer unfairly accused, a man who had served the community faithfully. Others saw him as the embodiment of unchecked power, a man who had finally been called to answer for his actions. The atmosphere was thick with division, like two invisible armies facing off in silence, waiting for the first move. The judge, an older man with gray hair and glasses perched low on his nose, tapped his gavel lightly, calling for order. His presence was calm yet commanding, a man who had presided over countless cases but who, today, seemed just as tense as the spectators. He knew this case had attracted unusual attention, not just from the local press but from civil rights advocates, community leaders, and even families who had quietly shared their own stories of fear. The bailiff, a stout man with a booming voice, called out names, moving the trial forward with steady rhythm. Witnesses were sworn in, lawyers shuffled their papers, and the jury sat attentively, 12 strangers bound together by duty and the weight of deciding another man's fate. Some jurors looked eager, others wary, but all of them glanced now and then toward the little girl seated with her mother, curiosity evident on their faces. Leaned down and whispered something in her daughter's ear. The child nodded solemnly, hugging the bunny, fought back tears. She had spent weeks questioning whether it was the right decision to allow her daughter to be brought into this courtroom. What could a 3-year-old possibly add? Would people take her seriously, or would they dismiss her words as childish rambling? But deep down knew her daughter had seen everything. She had been there, small and silent, her wide eyes watching when chaos erupted that night in the park. Across the aisle, the prosecutor, a man in his 40s with a tired face but sharp eyes, organized his notes carefully. He was known in the community for being relentless in pursuit of the truth, though some called him too idealistic. Today, though, even he felt the stakes pressing down. He knew that his case hinged not just on evidence but on testimony. Testimonies could sway hearts and minds in ways cold facts could not. And yet, he also knew the risk of putting a toddler on the stand. The defense attorney, a slick man with a tailored suit and a voice smooth as honey, seemed almost smug. He had already told the press that the prosecution's strategy was desperate. "A child, really," he had said in an interview. This is a court of law." He planned to dismantle any attempt to use the girl's words against his client. Still, as he glanced at her now, sitting so small yet strangely composed, a flicker of unease passed through him before he quickly masked it. The room shifted slightly as the judge cleared his throat. "This court will now come to order," he said firmly, his voice echoing off the walls. "Today we continue the matter of State versus Officer Daniel Brooks." His eyes swept the room, pausing for a moment on the jury, then on the small child sitting with her mother. He tapped his pen once against the desk, a subtle tell that he, too, was curious about what would unfold. A murmur rippled through the audience as word spread that the child would indeed be called to the stand. Some shook their heads, whispering about how wrong it was. Others leaned forward, eager to see how such a young voice could alter the course of something so serious. For a brief moment, the courtroom felt less like a hall of justice and more like a stage where everyone waited for the unexpected performance of a tiny, fragile witness. His heart pounded as the bailiff approached. She squeezed her daughter's hand gently, whispering, "It's okay, baby, just tell the truth." The little girl looked up at her mother, then at the sea of strangers staring back at her. She didn't understand the weight of what was about to happen. She only remembered the night in the park, the loud barking, her mother's screams, and the fear that had settled into her small body. To her, this wasn't about trials or justice. It was simply about telling what she saw. The prosecutor rose, adjusting his tie nervously. He knew that whatever came next could either break his case or turn it into something unforgettable. The defense attorney smirked, preparing to object at the slightest stumble. The judge leaned forward, gavel in hand, ready to maintain control. And the jury, 12 ordinary citizens, waited with bated breath. The child stood, guided by the bailiff toward the witness stand. Her tiny footsteps echoed louder than they should have, filling the room with an almost unbearable tension. She climbed onto the chair, feet dangling far above the ground, clutching her stuffed bunny as if it were her anchor in a storm. The room grew still. Not a cough, not a whisper. For the first time that morning, the divide in the gallery seemed to vanish. Supporters and skeptics alike leaned in, their differences momentarily forgotten. All of them, every lawyer, every juror, every spectator, were united in a single, breathless anticipation. The judge gave her a gentle smile. "Sweetheart," he said softly, his voice a rare mixture of authority and kindness, "do you know why you're here today?" The little girl blinked, her voice barely above a whisper but steady. "To tell the truth." And just like that, the entire courtroom, so full of tension, argument, and doubt, fell into a silence so deep it felt like the world had paused, waiting for the smallest witness to speak. The bailiff's large hand hovered protectively near the little girl's back as she made her way toward the witness stand. She was so small, so delicate against the scale of the room, that the very sight of her crossing the courtroom seemed surreal. The polished wooden floors, the towering benches, and the stern faces looming around her all dwarfed her tiny figure. She clutched her stuffed bunny even, its long ears dragging on the floor with each unsteady step. For a brief moment the air seemed to thin, as though everyone was holding their breath. Even the clack of the stenographer's keys slowed, as if reluctant to break the fragile silence. The girl's shoes, pink, scuffed, and clearly too worn for the occasion, clicked softly against the wood. Each step seemed louder than it should have, echoing like a drumbeat in the hushed room. Her mother sat rigid on the bench, hands clenched white in her lap. She wanted to run to her daughter to scoop her up and shield her from all those eyes, but she couldn't. This was part of the process. This was necessary. And yet her heart ached watching her baby walk alone toward the stand. The judge leaned forward, glasses sliding down his nose. His usual sternness melted slightly and his expression softened. "Come on up, sweetheart," he said, his voice warm, almost grandfatherly. It was a side of him rarely seen in court. "Don't worry, no one here is going to hurt you." The girl's large brown eyes darted around the room. She didn't understand the legalities, the importance of the moment, or the divide among the people watching. She only understood that her mother was scared and that she was supposed to help. She hugged the bunny, its stitched smile giving her a small ounce of courage. When she reached the witness chair, the bailiff helped her climb up. Her tiny legs dangled above the floor, swinging nervously. The chair seemed too big for her, as if it belonged to a world she had been thrust into far too soon. The defense attorney leaned back in his seat, an eyebrow raised. He whispered something into Officer Brooks' ear, eliciting a tight, forced smile from the man. They both seemed confident that whatever words the girl spoke could be dismissed. A toddler's testimony, after all, wasn't standard practice. To them, it was little more than a desperate ploy from the prosecution. But others in the room didn't share their certainty. The jurors shifted in their seats, eyes wide, expressions unreadable. Some leaned forward, clearly invested in every twitch, every glance of the little girl. Others looked skeptical, frowning as though questioning the fairness of the proceedings. Yet, despite their mixed feelings, none could look away. The prosecutor, carefully masking his nerves, knelt down so he was at eye level with her. He didn't want to appear intimidating. He knew children responded best to gentleness. His voice was soft, deliberate. "Hi there," he began with a smile. "Can you tell us your name?" The girl looked down at her bunny before answering. "Sophie," she whispered, her voice fragile but clear. "Hi, Sophie," the prosecutor said warmly. "That's a very pretty name, and who's that with you?" He gestured to the bunny. Sophie lifted it up slightly. "Bunny," she replied simply. A few people in the gallery chuckled softly, though quickly silenced themselves. The judge gave a brief but indulgent smile before regaining his composure. The prosecutor continued, careful not to push too quickly. "Do you know why you're here today?" Sophie nodded, her eyes still fixed on her bunny. "Mommy said I have to tell the truth." That single sentence washed over the courtroom like a wave. People shifted uncomfortably, struck by the sincerity of it. The defense attorney's smirk faltered, just slightly, as he scribbled something on his legal pad. The judge leaned forward again, his voice low but kind. "And do you promise you'll tell the truth, Sophie, just like Mommy asked?" She looked up at him, blinking slowly, then gave a small nod. "Yes." The bailiff, standing tall and serious, raised his right hand as he swore her in, the formality of the moment almost absurd against the innocence of the child. Still, procedure had to be followed. Sophie mimicked him clumsily, raising her tiny hand, bunny dangling precariously from her other arm. As the oath ended, Sophie glanced toward her mother, who mouthed the words, "It's okay." Eyes shimmered with tears, but there was pride too. Her daughter had made it this far, and that alone felt monumental. The prosecutor stood, papers in hand, but he didn't look at them. Instead, his gaze remained on Sophie, his tone gentle, as though he were speaking not in a courtroom but in a living room. "Sophie, do you remember the night at the park?" The gallery went silent. Even the defense attorney stopped writing. All eyes turned to the child, whose expression grew more serious. She nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. The word was small, but it carried weight far beyond its sound. His hands trembled in her lap. She remembered that night vividly, the flashing lights, the shouting, the snarling dog. But she hadn't realized until much later that her daughter had absorbed every detail, every frightening moment. She had thought Sophie was too young to understand, too young to remember. Yet here she was, remembering with perfect clarity. The defense attorney rose abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. This child is 3 years old. Any testimony from her is unreliable, inadmissible." The judge raised a hand, cutting him off. His voice was firm. "Overruled, counselor. She has been sworn in like any other witness. You will have your chance to cross-examine." The defense attorney sat back down reluctantly, his jaw tight. He leaned once more toward Officer Brooks, whispering sharply. Brooks didn't respond. He just stared at the girl, his face unreadable, though his knuckles whitened as he clenched his fists under the table. The prosecutor ignored the interruption, returning his attention to Sophie. "You said you remember the park. Can you tell us what you saw that night?" Sophie hugged Bunny. Her feet kicked softly in the air as she tried to find her words. The courtroom leaned in collectively, every ear straining for her small voice. "There was a doggy," she whispered, "a big doggy." A ripple spread through the room. Jurors exchanged glances. Reporters' pens scratched rapidly across paper. Even the judge's eyes sharpened, knowing they were finally approaching the heart of it all. The defense attorney opened his mouth to object again but stopped, sensing the jury's focus, the gravity of the moment. Sophie, unaware of the impact of her words, continued softly. He was barking, loud, and Mommy was scared. Her mother's tears spilled over now, her shoulders shaking silently. She pressed her hands against her mouth, trying to stifle the sound. The prosecutor's voice remained steady, but inside his chest his heart raced. "Sophie, can you tell us what happened with the doggy?" Sophie hesitated, her little brow furrowing as she remembered. She turned her eyes toward the lineup of photographs resting on the table. Several German shepherds stared back at her from glossy prints. Without prompting, her hand reached out. Her finger pressed firmly on one. "That one," she said, her voice louder this time. And just like that, the room froze. For a heartbeat, the courtroom was suspended in silence. The little girl's finger, so small and delicate, rested firmly on the photograph laid out before her. The glossy surface reflected the overhead lights, but no one cared about reflections. All eyes were fixed on that one picture, the German shepherd with alert ears, dark eyes, and a nameplate barely visible beneath its collar. "That one," Sophie repeated, her voice a fraction louder, carrying across the room with surprising clarity. It was a child's voice, soft and innocent, but its impact hit like a hammer blow. A murmur swept through the gallery, rippling like wind across tall grass. Some gasped openly, others leaned forward, and a few exchanged quick glances as if confirming they had all just witnessed the same thing. At the defense table, Officer Brooks stiffened. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing, and a faint flush crept up his neck. His hands clenched so tightly around the edge of the table that his knuckles whitened, the tendons straining beneath his skin. He did not look at the photograph. He looked instead at Sophie, his gaze hard and unblinking, though she remained oblivious to it. The defense attorney was the first to break the silence. He shot to his feet, his chair screeching loudly against the floor. "Objection, Your Honor," his voice rang out, breaking the delicate tension like a stone through glass. This is outrageous. She is a child of 3 years old. She cannot possibly be considered a credible witness in identifying a police animal. This is nothing but a dangerous stunt." The judge lifted his gavel but didn't strike it. His eyes studied Sophie for a long moment before turning to the defense attorney. "Counselor," he said slowly, his tone measured, "your objection is noted, but the witness has been sworn in and her testimony will stand. You will have your opportunity to cross-examine." The defense attorney's face reddened. He started to protest again, but something in the judge's expression warned him against pushing further. Grinding his teeth, he lowered himself back into his seat, muttering under his breath as he smoothed his suit jacket. The prosecutor, seizing the moment, leaned closer to Sophie. His voice was gentle but purposeful. "Sophie," he said softly, "can you tell us how you know it was that dog?" The room hushed again. This was the question that mattered, the key question. Everyone leaned in, the air heavy with anticipation. Sophie looked at the photograph, then at her stuffed bunny, then back to the prosecutor. Her small legs swung slowly beneath the chair, her feet unable to touch the floor. She furrowed her brow in concentration, as if searching for the right words. "Because," she said finally, "he barked mean." The phrase was simple, childlike, but it landed with startling force. It cut through the formalities, the legal jargon, the back and forth of trained attorneys. The jury shifted, some exchanging uneasy glances, others staring at Sophie as though they had just glimpsed a truth too raw to ignore. The prosecutor nodded encouragingly. "He barked mean. Can you tell us what else happened with that dog?" Sophie hesitated. Her grip on Bunny tightened, the fabric bunching in her fist. She glanced toward her mother, who mouthed the words, "It's okay." Encouraged, Sophie turned back to the prosecutor. "He ran at Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "And he didn't stop." A shiver moved through the room. Shoulders shook as tears streamed down her cheeks. She pressed a trembling hand over her mouth, trying to contain the sobs that threatened to escape. A sympathetic murmur rose from the gallery, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. The prosecutor's heart hammered in his chest. This was more than he could have hoped for, yet he knew he had to tread carefully. Sophie was fragile and the defense would pounce on any inconsistency. He leaned forward just slightly. "Sophie, did you see who was with the dog?" Before she could answer, the defense attorney leapt up again. "Objection, leading the witness." "Sustained," the judge replied firmly. His gaze, however, flicked briefly to Brooks, who now sat rigid, his face unreadable but his tension obvious. The prosecutor stepped back, choosing a different approach. "Sophie," he asked gently, "when you saw the dog barking, what did you see next?" Sophie took a deep breath, her little chest rising and falling quickly. She was nervous, but her voice carried a kind of clarity that only innocence could provide. "The doggy bit Mommy." The words were so small, so simple, and yet they exploded through the courtroom with devastating power. A gasp erupted from the gallery. The jurors froze, their eyes wide, expressions grim. Even the judge's hand paused mid-motion with the gavel. Broke down, sobs shaking her body as she clutched her hands tightly together. The prosecutor said nothing. He didn't need to. Sophie's words hung in the air like smoke, seeping into every corner of the room. The defense attorney scrambled to recover. He shot to his feet once more, voice rising with desperation. "Your Honor, I move to strike this testimony from the record. This child has been blatantly coached. She cannot possibly differentiate between memory and suggestion at her age. This is inadmissible." "Sit down, counselor," the judge said sharply, his tone cutting through the attorney's words like a blade. "The jury will decide the weight of her testimony." The defense attorney hesitated, visibly rattled. Slowly, he sank back into his seat, though his pen scratched furiously against his notepad as he prepared for cross-examination. Brooks leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, though a flicker of unease crossed his face for the first time. He glanced at Sophie, then at the jury, then back at his attorney. The confident facade he had worn earlier seemed to falter. The prosecutor, sensing the shift in the room, spoke again, his voice calm and steady. "Sophie, thank you for telling us that. Can you tell us how you know it was this dog?" Sophie looked back at the photograph, then at the jury, her small voice carrying across the room. "Because he barked mean and he didn't stop." The words landed like a final note in a symphony, resonating deeply in the hushed courtroom. For several seconds, no one moved. The silence was profound, pressing against everyone present. It wasn't the silence of boredom or indifference. It was the silence of realization, of hearts and minds confronting the unvarnished truth from the lips of a child too young to know how to lie convincingly. In that silence, the case shifted. Everyone felt it, the jurors, the judge, the attorneys, and most of all, Officer Brooks. What had seemed like a winnable defense a moment ago now teetered dangerously on the fragile, devastating testimony of a 3-year-old girl who simply told what she remembered. The photograph lay on the table like evidence in a murder case, but in that moment, it was more than a picture of a dog. It was a symbol, an anchor that tied the little girl's trembling voice to a physical, undeniable reality. Sophie's small finger still rested on the glossy surface, and though she had already withdrawn her hand, the impression lingered. Everyone in the room could almost see her pointing, as though the gesture had burned itself into their memory. Gasps had already rippled through the gallery, but now silence reigned. It was not the ordinary hush of a courtroom under order. It was the uneasy quiet of people recognizing the gravity of what they had just heard. Ordinary trials often ebbed and flowed with testimony, evidence, objections, and rulings. But this was different. This was a moment that seemed to tilt the entire case on its axis. On the defense side of the room, Officer Brooks shifted uncomfortably. His broad shoulders stiffened, and he attempted to mask his unease with a straight face, but he could not stop the flush rising to his cheeks. His breathing, once slow and measured, quickened slightly. He tapped his foot beneath the table, an unconscious rhythm betraying nerves he desperately wanted to conceal. His attorney noticed immediately. Leaning in, he whispered harshly, "Stay calm, it's a child, they'll never buy it." But his words lacked conviction. The attorney himself was rattled. He had built his strategy around discrediting adult witnesses, dismantling their accounts with precision and logic. But children were different. Children were unpredictable, and juries listened to them differently. No one wanted to believe a child could be manipulated into lying. Innocence, once spoken aloud, had a way of seeping through every legal argument like water through cracks. The prosecutor, on the other hand, remained motionless. He did not press further, not yet. He knew the power of silence. He let Sophie's words settle into the bones of everyone present, giving them time to echo, to sink in. He had prepared for this moment, but even he hadn't expected it to be so potent. The truth had not been dressed up in complicated language. It had been spoken plainly, devastatingly, by a 3-year-old who had no reason to lie. The judge, usually stoic, leaned back in his chair and adjusted his glasses. His gaze flicked toward the jury, and he noted the way they shifted in their seats. Some frowned deeply, others scribbled notes with newfound intensity, and a few simply stared at Sophie as though she were a puzzle they hadn't expected to solve. He tapped his gavel lightly, not to silence the room but to ground it. "Proceed," he said, though his voice betrayed the weight of what had just happened. The defense attorney rose to his feet once more, his expression a mask of outrage. "Your Honor, I renew my objection. This testimony is unreliable at best, prejudicial at worst. The child is 3 years old. She cannot possibly comprehend the significance of her words. To allow this testimony is to endanger the integrity of this trial." His voice grew louder with every sentence, as though volume could replace validity. But even as he spoke, he saw the jurors' faces, stern, skeptical, and increasingly impatient with his theatrics. He realized too late that his protestations might be doing more harm than good. The more he fought to silence the child, the more credible her words seemed. The judge raised his hand, his voice firm. "Counselor, I've ruled on this. The testimony stands. Sit down." The defense attorney froze, his jaw clenching. Slowly, he lowered himself back into his seat, though his eyes burned with frustration. He scribbled notes furiously, preparing for cross-examination, but in the back of his mind, he knew the damage had already been done. Sophie sat quietly in the oversized chair, her legs still swinging back and forth. She seemed oblivious to the storm her words had unleashed. To her, she had simply answered a question truthfully, as her mother had told her to. The weight of law, the shifting of power, the gasps of strangers, none of that reached her. She looked instead at Bunny, stroking its worn ear as if seeking comfort. The prosecutor finally spoke again, careful to keep his voice even. "Sophie," he said, "when you pointed to that dog, you said he barked mean and didn't stop. Can you tell us what happened after that?" Before Sophie could answer, the defense attorney bolted upright again. "Objection. He's leading the witness." "Sustained," the judge said. "Counsel, rephrase." The prosecutor nodded, unruffled. "Sophie, can you tell us what you remember about that night in your own words?" The little girl blinked, her brow furrowing as though she were concentrating very hard. She hugged Bunny close and took a deep breath. The entire courtroom leaned in, every heartbeat attuned to her next words. "I saw the doggy bite Mommy," she whispered. The sentence landed like a thunderclap. The gallery erupted in gasps. Some people covered their mouths, others shook their heads in disbelief. One woman in the back began to cry softly. The jury stiffened as though jolted by an invisible current, pens pausing mid-sentence. Even the court reporter, normally detached, hesitated before resuming her frantic typing. Broke down completely. Tears streamed down her face, and she pressed both hands to her mouth to keep from crying out. She had tried to prepare herself for this moment, had rehearsed it in her mind, but nothing could soften the blow of hearing her daughter describe the attack in her small, trembling voice. The judge banged his gavel sharply. "Order! Order in the court!" His voice boomed, but it was nearly drowned out by the rising tide of whispers and exclamations. It took several more strikes of the gavel before silence was restored. Officer Brooks sat motionless, though his face had turned an alarming shade of red. His jaw clenched, his nostrils flaring. For the first time, his composure cracked. He glanced toward his attorney, but the man was too busy scrambling through his notes to offer reassurance. The prosecutor, his voice steady, asked one final question for the moment. "Sophie, how do you know it was that dog, the one in the picture?" Sophie's answer was immediate, almost impatient, as though it were obvious. "Because he was angry, and he didn't stop barking." Her words, so plain and so childlike, carried a raw honesty that no adult testimony could match. There was no agenda, no exaggeration, just memory spoken aloud. And it was enough to silence even the most cynical heart in the room. For a long moment the courtroom remained utterly still. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of Sophie's testimony pressed down on every person present, undeniable and unshakable. The shock had settled in, and with it, the trial had changed forever. The moment had already turned the trial upside down. Sophie's identification of the dog had pierced through weeks of legal wrangling like a needle through cloth. But what came next, the words no one expected, would not just alter the course of the trial. It would silence the very room built for argument. The prosecutor hesitated, sensing the fragility of the moment. He knew children's testimonies were delicate, like soap bubbles floating in the air. Press too hard and it could pop. Handle it too softly and it might drift away without impact. His every instinct told him to tread carefully. "Sophie," he began gently, crouching just enough to make his eyes level with hers. "You're doing a very good job. Can you tell us more about what the doggy did that night?" The child pressed Bunny closer to her chest. Her lips moved, but no sound came at first. The room leaned in collectively, a sea of tense shoulders and unblinking eyes. Finally, her tiny voice broke through. "He bit Mommy," she whispered again. A murmur swept the gallery. But then, before anyone could process it, she continued, her words halting but clear. "And the man laughed." Gasps, audible, sharp, and immediate. The sound ricocheted through the courtroom, hitting every corner, bouncing off the wood-paneled walls. The man laughed. Two words that should never have belonged in the same sentence with pain. Two words that drew a line directly from the dog's violence to its handler. Two words that turned the spotlight not just on the animal, but on the officer seated grim-faced at the defense table. The judge's gavel pounded once, but it did little to tame the storm. Jurors' faces twisted with shock. One woman covered her mouth as though suppressing nausea. Another leaned forward, scribbling furiously in her notebook. A man on the far right simply shook his head, his jaw tight. Officer Brooks, caught off guard, blinked rapidly. His face drained of color. For the first time in the entire trial, he looked less like a disciplined officer of the law and more like a man cornered. His attorney shot him a warning glance, a silent order to remain composed, but Brooks' hand twitched against the table, betraying his simmering nerves. "Objection," the defense attorney roared, his voice slicing through the tension like a dull blade. "This is outrageous. She is a toddler, Your Honor. We cannot seriously treat these words as fact." The judge regarded him coolly. "Counsel, the jury will determine the weight of her testimony. Sit down." The lawyer's jaw tightened, but he obeyed. His movements were stiff, mechanical, as though he were fighting the urge to slam his fist against the table. The prosecutor, however, knew he had to act swiftly. The revelation was powerful, but he couldn't allow it to wither under cross-examination. He kept his tone measured. "Sophie," he said softly, "you said someone laughed. Can you tell us who?" The little girl turned her wide eyes toward the defense table. Her finger lifted, small and trembling, but unmistakable in its direction. Him. The word was no louder than a whisper, but in that silence it carried like thunder. Gasps broke out again, followed by stunned silence. Even the air felt heavier, as if everyone were trapped in that single moment. Tears streaming down her face, sobbed openly now, unable to hold back the emotion she had suppressed for so long. Her body shook as though the memory had been ripped open afresh. The defense attorney shot to his feet again. "Your Honor, I demand a mistrial. This is prejudicial beyond reason. She's been coached, clearly. This spectacle is nothing short of manipulation." The judge's gavel cracked against the sound block once, twice, 3 times. His face was stern, his voice booming. "Enough! Sit down, counselor, before I hold you in contempt." The attorney froze, his anger checked by the threat. Slowly, he lowered himself, but his glare never left the prosecutor. The prosecutor leaned in again, his voice even gentler now. "Sophie, can you tell us what Mommy did when the dog bit her?" The child's brow furrowed. She spoke slowly, her voice trembling. She screamed and fell down, and she said, "Please stop." The words ripped through the courtroom like a jagged blade. The prosecutor didn't need to press further. He didn't need to explain. The picture was painted with the unfiltered brushstrokes of a child's memory. The judge glanced toward the jury, his normally impassive expression giving way to something harder, more human. He saw their faces, shocked, pale, unsettled. He knew the trial had shifted irreversibly. The prosecutor gave a small nod, signaling that he was done for now. He had everything he needed, and more. When the defense attorney finally rose for cross-examination, the room tensed. His voice, though restrained, was laced with bitterness. "Sophie," he said, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace, "sometimes we dream about things, don't we? Sometimes we see something on TV and think it really happened, isn't that right?" Sophie tilted her head, puzzled. "No, this was real." The defense pressed. "But you're very little, aren't you? Sometimes little kids get confused. Isn't it possible you're confused about this night?" The little girl shook her head firmly. "I'm not confused. The doggy bit Mommy," and he laughed. The lawyer froze. His strategy had failed. The words hit harder the second time, repeated with innocent certainty. He could almost feel the jury pulling away from him, siding with the child without hesitation. He backed away, defeated, muttering, "No further questions." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even after the judge dismissed Sophie from the stand, the courtroom could not recover. The image she had painted lingered, a brutal act of violence, witnessed through innocent eyes, framed by the cruelty of laughter. As rushed forward to scoop her daughter into her arms, the gallery stood in quiet awe. Some dabbed their eyes. Others sat rigid, processing what they had heard. The gavel struck once more to announce a recess, but even then, the silence lingered. The unexpected words had been spoken, and nothing, not the defense, not objections, not even time, could erase them. The recess had ended, but the courtroom hadn't recovered. When the judge returned to the bench and the jury filed back into their seats, the silence was heavier than before. Not even the squeak of chairs or the shuffle of papers seemed to disturb it. The room held its breath, as if every person inside knew they were bearing witness to something that would not be forgotten. Sophie's words, "and he laughed," still echoed like a haunting refrain. The phrase was simple, almost childlike in its delivery, but the cruelty it suggested had seeped into the collective imagination of everyone present. People could not stop seeing it. The image of a mother begging for mercy, a dog sinking its teeth into her, and a uniformed officer laughing. The prosecutor rose slowly, buttoning his jacket with deliberate calm. He glanced at the jury first, then at the judge, before turning back to the stand where Sophie had been only moments ago. Though the chair was now empty, its presence loomed larger than ever. "Ladies and of the jury," he began, his voice low but steady, "you have just heard testimony that no child should ever have to give. A 3-year-old girl, who cannot be accused of scheming, exaggerating, or fabricating, sat here and told you what she saw. She pointed to the dog. She described the attack. And she told you something no parent, no citizen, no human being could dismiss, that while her mother begged for mercy, the man entrusted to protect them laughed. His words fell slowly, like heavy stones into still water. Each one created ripples that spread across the faces of the jurors. One man clenched his jaw. Another rubbed his forehead. A woman in the front row pressed her lips together, blinking rapidly. Across the aisle, the defense attorney scrambled. He scribbled notes, whispered frantically to his client, and occasionally glanced toward the jury as if trying to measure just how badly the tide had turned. Officer Brooks sat stiff and motionless, his face pale, his eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance. The prosecutor continued, "You don't need me to tell you what you saw just now. You don't need me to explain the power of that testimony. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't complicated. It was simple truth, spoken in the only way a child knows how. And it confirmed everything the other evidence in this case has been building toward." He paused, letting the silence stretch. Then he turned and returned to his table, signaling that his point had been made. The defense attorney stood reluctantly, smoothing his tie with trembling hands. His voice, though sharp, lacked the conviction it had earlier in the trial. "Members of the jury," he began, "what you heard from that child, though moving, though emotional, must be weighed with extreme caution. Children are impressionable. They repeat things they hear from adults. They misinterpret. They confuse dreams with reality. You cannot, in good conscience, allow the entire fate of this man to rest on the words of a toddler who still sleeps with a stuffed rabbit." He gestured toward the empty chair, but his attempt to minimize Sophie's presence only made it feel larger. His words rang hollow in the air. "Furthermore," he added, "there is no video, no independent witness, no hard evidence confirming this alleged laughter. What you have is hearsay, filtered through the limited understanding of a child. I urge you, no, I beg you, not to let emotion cloud the truth. Officer Brooks is a decorated member of the force, a man who has served this community faithfully for years. Do not allow his life and career to be destroyed by the unreliable testimony of a 3-year-old." But the more he spoke, the more obvious his desperation became. His tone was defensive, his cadence rushed. He sounded less like a man defending his client and more like someone trying to convince himself of the words leaving his mouth. When he sat down, the air in the courtroom did not lighten. If anything, it grew heavier. The jurors avoided his gaze, their eyes instead drifting toward who still sat near the front row, her daughter cradled in her arms. The sight of the child, now quietly sucking her thumb, reminded them of what they had heard. The defense's words could not erase it. The judge called for the next witness, but even as testimony resumed, it was clear that Sophie's voice lingered. Each new piece of evidence, each question and answer, was now colored by what had been said. The jurors listened differently. Their skepticism had shifted, replaced with a sharpened sense of scrutiny aimed not at the prosecution but at the defense. Later in the afternoon, the prosecution introduced an expert witness, a canine behavior specialist who had examined the records of the police dog in question. The expert that the K9 had a documented history of aggressive behavior and that the handler, Officer Brooks, was repeatedly warned about improper commands. The jury leaned forward, hungry for facts that supported what they had already begun to believe. When the expert was asked whether the dog could have inflicted the wounds described, he nodded firmly. "Without question," he said, "the bite pattern is consistent. The injuries align perfectly with a K9 trained to subdue, not maim. What occurred that night was not a mistake. It was an intentional deployment." The prosecutor seized the moment. "And in your professional opinion, would the handler know exactly what the dog was doing while those bites were occurring?" "Yes," the expert replied. "A handler always knows. The commands are deliberate. The dog does not act alone." The words landed with devastating force. It wasn't just the dog on trial anymore. It was the man behind the leash. The defense objected furiously, but his protests grew weaker with each passing hour. The jury wasn't listening to him anymore. They were listening to Sophie, even when she wasn't speaking. By the time court adjourned for the day, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Reporters whispered outside the courthouse, already drafting headlines. Spectators lingered in the gallery, shaken by what they had witnessed. And the jurors, instructed not to discuss the case, exchanged brief glances that betrayed the storm raging in their minds. Inside the defense's conference room, chaos reigned. The attorney paced like a caged animal, muttering about damage control, about jury psychology, about possible motions to suppress. But Brooks sat in silence, his eyes cold and distant. For the first time, he seemed to realize that his badge, his authority, and his reputation could no longer shield him. A child's words had pierced through all of it. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the courthouse held Sophie close, whispering into her hair. "You did so good, baby. You did so good." Tears streamed down her face, but her voice carried pride. For years, she had carried the weight of that night alone, doubted, dismissed, and ridiculed. Now, because of her daughter's courage, the truth had been spoken in the one place it mattered most. The gavel's echo might have faded for the day, but its resonance lingered. The courtroom had reacted, not with noise, but with a silence more powerful than words. The silence of people who had heard the truth and could not it. And tomorrow, when the trial resumed, that silence would sit beside the jury, heavy as a shadow. The next morning, the courthouse felt different. The crowd outside had doubled, reporters jockeying for position, microphones and cameras aimed like weapons at anyone who dared emerge from the heavy oak doors. Headlines already buzzed through the air. Toddler points to police dog. Child witness stuns court with testimony. Inside, the air was no less charged. The jurors sat quietly in their box, but their eyes carried a weight that had not been there before. They had all gone home with Sophie's voice echoing in their minds, and no amount of cautionary instruction from the judge could erase the image she had painted. The defense knew it. When court reconvened, Officer Brooks's attorney stood with renewed determination. His jaw was tight, his papers stacked neatly, but there was a restless twitch in his hand as he adjusted his tie. He was a man about to attempt the impossible, undo the damage inflicted by a 3-year-old's unshakable words. "Your Honor," he began, his voice sharper than usual, "before we continue, I must again raise a motion to strike the testimony of the child witness. It is prejudicial, unreliable, and has unfairly influenced the jury against my client." The judge regarded him with weary patience. "Counselor, I have ruled on this matter. The testimony stands. Proceed." The lawyer swallowed his frustration. His first strike had failed. He turned instead to cross-examination of the expert witnesses, hopping to chip away at the foundation the prosecution had carefully built. The canine behavior specialist was still on the stand, sitting calmly, hands folded. His credentials were impeccable, decades of experience, dozens of court appearances, and a reputation for blunt honesty. "Doctor," the defense attorney said, forcing a polite tone, "you've that the dog's behavior that night was not accidental, but intentional. Are you suggesting this animal somehow acted with human judgment?" The expert raised an eyebrow. "No, sir. I'm saying the dog responded exactly as it was trained to respond. Dogs don't make choices about right or wrong. They follow commands." "Ah," the lawyer said quickly, seizing on the answer. "So, it's possible that the dog simply misinterpreted a situation, that perhaps the chaos of the evening caused the animal to act on instinct, without specific direction from Officer Brooks." The expert shook his head firmly. "Not possible. These dogs are trained with precision. They act on commands and they stop on commands. If the attack continued, it was because the handler allowed it to continue." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The defense attorney's lips tightened. He pivoted, trying another angle. "But memory, doctor, memory is not perfect. The child who yesterday, would you agree that her recollection of such an event could be flawed? That perhaps she confused what she saw with what she was told afterward? The expert hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with being drawn into questions beyond his expertise. I can only speak to the behavior of the animal. As to memory, well, children often remember traumatic events vividly, sometimes more vividly than adults. It wasn't the answer the defense wanted. It only reinforced the image the jury already carried. By the time the witness was excused, the defense attorney's face glistened with sweat. His strategy of dismantling the prosecution's foundation had only cemented it further. He tried again with the medical examiner, calling into question the wound analysis. "Doctor, is it not true that the injuries could have come from another large dog, perhaps one not connected to law enforcement at all?" The examiner's answer was curt. "No, the wound pattern is highly specific to a trained canine. Civilian dogs do not inflict such symmetrical tearing." "Isn't it possible?" "No." The single word rang out like a hammer striking steel. The defense attorney's shoulders slumped. Another strike, another miss. The prosecutor sat silently through it all, his expression unreadable. He didn't need to intervene. Every time the defense swung, they missed, and the jury saw it. Finally, when the defense attorney had run out of ways to poke holes in the testimony, he made one last desperate move. He called Officer Brooks himself to the stand. The courtroom buzzed at the announcement. It was a risky gamble. Defendants often avoided testifying to prevent damaging cross-examination, but Brooks's attorney must have decided it was his only chance left to humanize the officer, to let the jury hear his voice and see his face as more than an accusation. Brooks walked stiffly to the stand, his uniform replaced by a simple suit and tie. He raised his hand, swore the oath, and sat down, his face composed but his jaw tight. "Officer Brooks," his attorney began gently, "how long have you served this community?" 15 years, Brooks replied, his voice deep but steady. "And in those 15 years, have you received commendations for your service?" "Yes, several, for bravery, for community outreach, for exceptional service." The attorney nodded, turning to the jury as if to say, "See, this is not a monster, this is a man." "Now, officer," he continued, "let's talk about the night in question. What happened?" Brooks straightened his shoulders. "I responded to a disturbance in the park. It was dark, chaotic, there was shouting. My K-9 partner was with me. At some point he engaged. It all happened very quickly." "And did you, at any time, instruct your dog to attack the woman seated here?" "No," Brooks said firmly. "Absolutely not. I would never do that." "And did you laugh, as was alleged yesterday by the child witness?" Brooks's jaw tightened. He shook his head. "No, I did not laugh. That's absurd. I was focused on controlling the situation, not mocking anyone." The defense attorney nodded solemnly, as if the denial alone should carry weight. "Thank you, officer." But when the prosecutor rose for cross-examination, the room braced. "Officer Brooks," he began smoothly, "you say you never commanded your dog to attack, and yet the attack happened. Is that correct?" Brooks hesitated. "Yes, the dog misinterpreted." The prosecutor tilted his head. "Misinterpreted? After years of specialized training, after hundreds of hours of precise drills, you expect this jury to believe the dog simply misunderstood?" Brooks shifted uncomfortably. "It was dark, stressful. These things happen." The prosecutor's voice sharpened. "And when Ms. Carter was on the ground, screaming for help, did you command your dog to release?" Brooks's silence lasted too long. "Yes or no, officer?" I don't recall exactly," Brooks muttered. A ripple spread through the jury box. The prosecutor pounced. "You don't recall? A woman was being mauled by your K-9, and you don't recall whether you ordered the dog to stop? Officer, this is not a detail one forgets. Unless, of course, you didn't order the dog to stop at all. Brooks bristled. That's not true. The prosecutor leaned in, his voice low but piercing. And what about the laughter? A 3-year-old with no knowledge of your reputation, no agenda, sat here yesterday and told this jury that as her mother begged for mercy, you laughed. Do you deny that? I deny it completely, Brooks snapped. The prosecutor's voice rose. So you expect this jury to believe that a toddler fabricated not only what she saw but also what she heard, that she imagined laughter in the middle of her mother's terror. Brooks opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked at his attorney, then at the judge, then finally at the jury. Their eyes bore into him, cold and unforgiving. He swallowed hard. The silence spoke louder than any denial he could muster. By the time he was excused, the damage was irreversible. His testimony had been meant to save him, but instead it had revealed cracks, hesitations, contradictions, and above all, a chilling lack of remorse. The defense had struggled, and now they were drowning. The courtroom had grown used to tension, but on the morning of closing arguments, the atmosphere felt like something alive, thick, restless, and heavy with anticipation. Reporters scribbled furiously, spectators craned their necks, and the jury sat with the solemn expression of people who understood the weight of what lay before them. The defense attorney rose first. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and faced the jury with the desperate courage of a man clinging to fraying rope. "Ladies and," he began, "what you heard in this courtroom was tragic. There is no denying that Ms. Carter suffered, no denying the pain, the scars, the trauma, but you must separate sympathy from fact. My client, Officer Brooks, did not command his dog to attack. He did not laugh, as alleged. He is a man who has given 15 years of his life to protecting this very community." He walked slowly in front of the jury box, his voice trembling between defiance and pleading. "Do not let emotion cloud your judgment. A child's memory, though moving, is unreliable. Expert witnesses may be impressive, but they are still only offering opinions. At the end of the day, the prosecution has not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Officer Brooks intended harm, and without intent, there can be no conviction." He stopped, placed his hands flat on the rail, and lowered his voice. "Don't let one tragic incident erase a lifetime of service. Find him not guilty." He sat heavily, wiping sweat from his brow. The prosecutor rose next, his movements steady, his expression controlled but intense. He carried no stack of papers, only his own conviction. "Ladies and," he said, his voice low but powerful, "let us strip this case down to what it truly is. A woman was mauled by a police dog. She begged for help, and the man trained and sworn to protect her stood by and laughed." He turned sharply, pointing toward the defense table. "This is not about confusion, not about chaos. The dog did not misinterpret. The handler allowed it. He allowed it because in that moment he did not see a citizen. He did not see a mother, he saw less. And he enjoyed it." The words sliced through the air. The prosecutor walked closer to the jury, locking eyes with each member in turn. "We do not have to wonder what happened. We know. A child barely 3 years old remembered what we wish she hadn't. She remembered the truth. Her innocence is the very reason you must believe her. She had nothing to gain. She did not even understand the courtroom, the trial, the stakes. And yet she told us with a trembling finger and 2 simple words exactly what happened." He paused, letting silence fill the chamber. Then he continued softly. "And you heard the experts. You saw the wounds. You listened to the contradictions in Officer Brooks's testimony. He could not recall giving the release command. He could not answer for the laughter. His silence, his hesitations, they speak louder than words." The prosecutor stepped back. His final words rang like a bell. "Justice is not about protecting power. It is about protecting the powerless. Today you must be their voice. Find him guilty." He sat and the courtroom remained hushed, as though no one dared to breathe. The judge instructed the jury and dismissed them to deliberate. As they filed out, the world outside the jury room seemed to grind to a halt. Hours passed. Coffee grew cold on desks. Reporters paced the marble halls. Spectators whispered rumors of a deadlock, then silenced themselves, afraid to jinx the outcome. Inside the jury room, 12 men and women wrestled with the weight of the case. They replayed Sophie's trembling words. They studied the photographs of wounds. They debated the meaning of Brooks's pauses. For some, the decision came easily. For others, it took agonizing hours. But when the door finally opened, the courthouse erupted in movement. The jury had reached a verdict. The bailiff's voice called the court back into session. The defendant rose. The gallery stilled. Sophie, too young to understand the magnitude, sat quietly in her grandmother's lap, her small fingers clutching a stuffed bear. The foreperson stood, a slip of paper in her trembling hand. On the charge of aggravated assault under color of law, we find the defendant guilty. The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock, relief, and awe. Gasps filled the gallery. Reporters leapt to their feet, scribbling furiously. Some spectators wept. Others simply sat in stunned silence. Brooks's face turned ashen. His attorney's head dropped into his hands. The prosecutor exhaled slowly, his eyes closing as though releasing a burden he had carried for months. The judge's gavel struck, order in the court. But order was impossible. The silence that followed the verdict wasn't absence of sound. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of every chest in the room. People looked around, realizing they had witnessed not just a trial but a turning point. For Sophie, the moment was incomprehensible. She leaned against her grandmother's shoulder, whispering, "Can we go home now?" For her mother, tears streamed down her face, not just for justice served, but for the innocence her daughter had been forced to surrender. For Officer Brooks, the walls seemed to close in. The uniform he had once worn with pride now felt like a shackle. He was led away, his wrists bound in cuffs, the echo of chains a stark reminder that even those in power could fall. The sentencing came weeks later, but the weight of the verdict itself was enough to change the city. Policies shifted. The police department underwent investigations. Training protocols for K-9 units were rewritten. And across the country, other cases, long buried, long ignored, were reopened, victims emboldened by the courage of one small child. Sophie grew up shielded from most of it, her family determined to give her a normal life. Yet whispers of her role in the trial followed them wherever they went. People stopped her mother in grocery stores, thanking her. Strangers sent letters, calling Sophie the girl who spoke the truth. The courtroom incident became a story told in classrooms, in legal seminars, in hushed conversations about justice and accountability. And always at the center of it was the memory of a 3-year-old pointing her tiny finger at a police dog and saying 2 words that silenced an entire room. In the end, the trial was never just about guilt or innocence. It was about the power of truth spoken by the smallest among us. It was about a system forced to confront itself. It was about silence, the silence that follows cruelty, the silence that follows justice, and the silence that remains when the world realizes it has changed. As the courthouse emptied that final day, the echo of Sophie's words lingered, not as evidence but as a reminder. Sometimes justice is not delivered by the powerful, but by the innocent, who see what adults refuse to admit. And for years to come, anyone who entered that courtroom swore they could still feel it, the silence that fell when a child revealed the truth.